Intro. Ever since 1950, when Sir Humphrey Barton crossed the Atlantic in Virtue 35 XXXV, there's been a steady trickle of small sturdy boats westwards across the Atlantic and beyond. Dr. David Lewis and Cardinal Virtue participated in the first single-handed transatlantic race in 1960, while Commander Hamilton and his wife Jill in solo ventured into the Pacific in 1956. Many other long passages have been made in Virtues, and a listing of those prior to the 80s can be found in a book called Virtue by Peter Wallace. When in 1993 we saw Wandering Star lined up outside Deacon's Brokerage on the Hamble River, we immediately began negotiations and became ours soon afterwards. We've been living in Southampton for a year and planning to return to Australia in 1995. The attractive possibility now lay before us of sailing back to Australia. Yay! Wandering Star, we thought, was a still Virtue. It was built in Holland and first registered in 1963. Despite her age, she appeared to us to be fairly good order. The surveyor could find no serious problems with her, and as we eagerly awaited the completion of the necessary paperwork, we scrubbed the mud from the bottom and bought cans of anti-fouling paint and decided to change the colour of the hull from dark green to bright red. We fully expected to launch the boat within a fortnight and to be sailing within the month. Things did not go entirely to plan, however, and it was over a year before our first sail. Our first obstacle concerned the boat's registration. We knew that the UK Big Ships Part 1 register would be the only form of documentation we could reasonably guarantee title with. This would be especially important if we wanted to bring the boat into Australia and reflag it. We've given very little documentation other than the small ship's registry document and a small collection of papers. Fortunately, one handwritten sheet had a number on it, and the surveyor said that could be a Part 1 rego number. So, feeling inspired, we decided to contact all the registry offices in the UK, starting with London. This proved successful, and having determined the home port was London, we paid a visit to the London Registry Office to view the register. This cost £25. We decided to travel to London by train from Havant, near Portsmouth. The registry building and office was very security conscious. Unfortunately, we had made an appointment to view the register and were given the contact name of a person in the office, and everything went smoothly. That was, well, up to a point. The register was a magnificent leather-bound book, almost 1 metre high and half a metre wide. The writing was in magnificent script, with the name in letters about 3 inches high at the top of the page. Unfortunately, this is all computerised now. The registration had not been updated in 10 years, and the last entry was that of a mortgage entered in 1984. And from what we knew, the boat had changed hands at least twice since then. Before we could go further, we knew we had to bring the Part 1 register up to date. We decided the boat was worth the effort and spent the next 2 months tracing previous owners and arranging several statutory declarations for the registry office. We had the names of 2 previous owners, but no current addresses. There was about 102 phone books in the United Kingdom, and there was only one way to search through them, and that was slowly. Fortunately, one of the previous owners was still in the same area, and the other owner was the only one had a matching initial for the hundreds of surnames. Needless to say, the last name we found in the phone book was in phone book number 100. So perseverance paid off, and Wandering Star soon became ours in June 1993. and we had full registration documentation to prove it. Surely it would not be long before we were afloat. Anyway, by talking to the previous owner, we were able to get a feeling for the history of the boat and its gear. The boat had an Arc Rally 89 sticker on the window. The Arc Rally for cruisers. We'd followed this up through the very helpful Arc organisers and discovered the boat did not in fact take part in this event. When we finally contacted the owner, we discovered that he had planned to participate in the rally and had done quite an extensive refit in Fleet near Blackpool, north of Liverpool. The first leg of the journey took them to Southern Ireland and then back across to southern Cornwall. This was meant to be their shakedown cruise. However, they went no further. Unfortunately for us, the refit meant some new sails and stainless shrouds had been purchased, and these were still in good order. Fitting out. We decided to insure the boat and found it was necessary to have a full survey. We decided to use the surveyor who used the ultrasound method to determine the plate thickness. Also, as with many old steel vessels, there was a number of doubling plates on the hull that looked like band-aids. The surveyor extensively tested the hull and said it was sound and seaworthy. Then we employed a welder for an hour to do a few small repairs. This was money well spent, for he commented that some of the steel was porous and hard to weld. This was a new concept to us. We're on a steep learning curve here. Porous and steel were two words that definitely do not meaningfully mix for the layperson. However, we began to appreciate porous steel was when we started to clean the steel for painting and noticed yellow drips coming through this shiny steel. So once again we decided to take no half measures that would be acceptable, and we would find out the cause of the problem and remove all the doubling plates and replace the plate underneath. The cause of the problem was the cement ballast, which was wet. In fact, very wet. We started the bow and removed the ballast from behind the doubling plates and discovered the whole plate had rusted away, and then began removing all the thin plate and finally had an opening large enough for Helen to climb through. At this stage we employed another expert, this time from a marine engineering company, who gave us a quote and advice what to do. Pat was a welder slash shipbuilder who was also building his own spray design yacht in his spare time. We're feeling a bit depressed about our project at this stage, but the look on Pat's face made us feel even worse. His estimate for the job would be £1,500 for each side, and this was rather beyond our budget. He also suggested, as an alternative, that we could do it ourselves for considerably less. This is what we've been planning to do, and he offered his services free of charge in the future if we needed it. And from this point, things started to improve, as we purchased a MIG welder for about £230 and located the local steel supplier. And then we decided to scrap all the expensive ultrasound data, and if there was any doubt about the steel thickness, we'd drill a hole and measure it. The rest of the ballast still seemed wet, so we decided to drill holes in the base of the keel near each frame and drain it off any further water. Under the saloon was an integral water tank with cement beneath it, and we drilled an exploratory hole. When no water was found and no water came out the keel drain holes, we were confused. We then had a brainwave and reversed the suction on our cheap vacuum clean so it blew air down the exploratory hole. The arshy blows came the cry from Helen when the fountain of water shot out the keel drain hole. Water was in fact fresh, and we soon discovered the inside of the keel and the ballast was coated with red lead. Thus the water in the tank must have been quite tasty. We then decided to remove all the remaining ballast, which consisted of 20-kilo iron ingots set in cement. This was relatively easy done with an electric kanga hammer in a day. Previously, we'd been very carefully removing the ballast material with a drill and a 10-pound hammer. That was hard work. We removed about 500 kilos of iron ingots and then decided to replace the lot with lead ingots. The lead was more compact and we decided it would give us about 2 cubic feet of extra space in the keel, so this would help lower the centre of gravity of the boat and improve the seaworthiness. This was done during the autumn, and early snowfalls made the melting of scrap lead a cheery experience. Most of the scrap we used was old water pipe and roofing lead from London. After experimenting with various moulds, we discovered that a half-pound bread tin was the best after we removed the non-stick tinning on it. This gave us a 9-kilo ingot that was really easy to handle. Old boats are always full of surprises. We decided not to grip blast the whole hull, and in some places the hull surface was very uneven. Due, we thought, to was accumulation of layers of anti-fouling. On the outside of the starboard keel, there was an area that was 1 metre square that had an unusual texture. I casually investigated this one day by just grinding some of the paint off one side, and surprise, surprise, it was a fiberglass patch. Now we had to worry about osmosis as well. Well, not really. This was linked to the cement ballast. And we quickly removed the damaged area, which essentially was basically a 2-inch split in the hull plate. Also, the surveyor identified a leak in the bottom of the keel as coming from a leaking bilge drain plug. Fortunately, investigation showed this was in fact not the case, and we were looking at more damaged plate. The boat had been sitting on the heart for at least a month at this stage and was still dripping. One area of the keel, which contained poured lead ballast, had a doubling patch, which we removed to find a massive crumbly oxidized material. The original patch had only been 2 inches square, but by the time it was cut back to the healthy metal, the new patch was to be just over 1 foot square. This has been caused by salt water getting into the top of the ballast between the lead and the steel keel. Anyway, early on in the refit, we decided to deal with the cavernous bilges under the motor. And when we first inspected the boat, the atmosphere below was stifling with fumes of diesel and oil in the bilge. We moved the engine forward and into the main saloon to give us easy access to the bilges, which were inches deep in grease and gunge. The engine is a 1960 Saab from Norway engine with a big flywheel and variable pitch propeller that develops about 8.5 horsepower flat out. The only problem is the motor weighs about 200 plus kilograms, so moving it was exciting. The motor has an attachment for a crank handle for a hand start, which is described in the manual. However, the previous owners who had owned the boat for about 3 years had never seen the crank handle. Guess what we found in the archaeological dig in the bilge? Yes, one crank handle, plus a couple of spanners, sorted paintbrushes, and we then decided to cap all the bilges and bolt down lids, and this would stop the loss of further gear into inaccessible areas and would provide extra buoyancy compartments. All bilges were cleaned and treated with rust and then painted with epoxy tar. All compartments with ballast were sealed with pitch, and pitch was poured over each layer of lead ingots. We wanted to have a 100% dry boat where spiders living happily in our dry bilges. This did not quite happen. However, any water that did get in was quickly seen and easily dealt with. Work progressed well, and in August the specialist Australian painting team arrived in the form of Helen's parents. We were still very optimistic at this stage, but it was not until Easter '94 that we finally were able to launch. The final finishing touches took many months, as it turned out. By now we turned our very critical gaze to other pieces of equipment. The head of the rudder was totally rusted out and had to be replaced. The tow rail was of mild steel tube, which gives a very nice finish. However, if fittings are bolted onto the tubes, water seems to get in, and the tow rail begins rusting. The chains plates were welded to these tubes, so when we had saw the giveaway weeping yellow signs of rust near this area, there was only one solution, i.e. replace the tube and the chain plates. The plumbing caused many headaches as well. All the brass fittings were replaced and welded standpipes looked fine. The inlet and outlet for the head were on welded standpipes, and even though the head was a year old or so, we decided to pull down the valves on these pipes. One of the attaching bolts was a bit stiff, so we gave the spanner a tap with the hammer, and the whole 12-inch pipe crumbled in a heap. This gave us an opportunity to close the inlet and reposition the outlet. We decided there were a few too many openings through the hull, so now we have one saltwater inlet for the head and the sink. While cleaning the bottom, we decided to test the cockpit drains, which were welded steel pipes located at the rear of the cockpit. The diagnostic test consisted of using a screwdriver with a 1/4-inch flathead as a probe and gently hitting it as hard as we could. The portside wells gave way with the first hit. This meant a lot of work because the area under the cockpit was very small and cramped for using a grinder and a welder. It was almost too cramped for the welding helmet. Fortunately, we were able to locate some steam pipe and get it bent up so the port side drained to the starboard, etc. This very critical approach paid off, for we had no problems with the hull for the whole trip. When we were sailing between Bora Bora and Rarotonga, we were listening to Arnold's morning weather report from the Cook Islands. Each report begins with, "Before I continue with the weather, is there any emergency traffic?" And on this particular day, the reply came back, yes, we're sinking." And this was from an old Dutch boat, which was a 40-foot long and built of steel, and they were leaking from the aft near the rudder stock or sked, and neither the skipper nor his wife could identify the cause, and all they could do was man the pumps and keep sailing to the next island, which was quite a distance away. They were sailing downwind in 25 to 35 knots of wind and doing about 7 knots. Eventually they were rescued by another boat called Jonathan Seagull. There are no shortcuts when it comes to fitting out an old boat for a serious voyage. With care and critical eye, the vessel can be returned to its optimum condition. Better still, it can be upgraded to a better standard than when it was first constructed. This is what we achieved by using lead ballast and sealing the lids of the bilges. One of our ongoing discussions concerned whether rebuilding an old boat is better than building a new one. On the positive side, the design and the basic structure of Wandering Star was excellent, and no one is building small round bilge boats like this nowadays. So one of the main structural features was the frames were about 13 inches apart and there were no longitudinal stringers for holding water and rust. Also, the internal timber fit out is lovely and consists of solid pieces of timber over insulation. The only section we had to rebuild was around the galley, and also the older boat is certainly cheaper to purchase, but cost of labour input is significant. Yes, definitely significant. Anyway, it was all good fun. Launching. The clock was ticking and we began organising to launch the vessel before Easter '94. The last coat of red topside paint went on in an unusually dry week early in the month. While painting the transom, yet another irregular surface was noticed, and using the screwdriver technique, we found another hole. This was due to water accumulation in the frames in the lazarette not being able to drain. The yellow peril was booked, and this fine piece of European machinery was similar to a trailer that goes behind a tractor. And then there was many hydraulic pads and rams. However, all over the boat, all the boat's weight was on 2 rear pads and a forward crossbar. The advantage of this was the keel was clear of the ground for the weekend and could be painted, etc. Also, it turned out there was the largest pit in the base of the keel, which we welded up. The only problem with this launching system was that the forward crossbar removed all the paint from a 2-inch area on the stem. The launch was quite exciting, but not spectacular, as the trailer backed down the ramp at low tide and the boat floated off on the rising tide. Andy stayed on board and ran around checking the skin fittings, etc., and Helen took photos. Hooray, we're afloat after 12 months of hard work. Engine. We decided to replace all the plastic fuel lines with copper pipe. The main fuel tank had been a 40-litre Vitus tank in the lazarette, a plastic tank, and we were concerned that this was excessive weight so far aft. There was also a stainless 40-litre tank under the port cockpit seats, which had not been connected. And after studying the engine manual, we decided to use the stainless tank with copper piping. All we had to do was weld in a breather of stainless pipe, which was easily to do with our MIG set. There was a glass separator for separating any water out of the fuel, which we decided to replace with something more sturdy. This was a good idea, as we discovered the original one had been installed in reverse. The great day arrived to start the motor. First we tried the electric start with no luck. Then we tried the manual start many times and decided to try various cold start techniques. First one was using a cigarette, in inverted commas, which is placed in the head of the motor behind a big bolt. This is the same effect as a glow plug, and it works when it works, and it didn't. The second method is to remove the head bolt and put some squirts of oil in. This increases the compression for starting. This did not work either, so we remembered a technique we'd read about that they used in Antarctica, which involved heating the whole engine block. Instead of oxyacetylene torches, we used a small air blow heater with mains electricity. We set this up, and then friends came to visit, as they always do, and we had a cup of tea and forgot about the heater. 3 hours later, the whole engine was warm to touch, and we were able to start it with the crank. 4 turns, dropped the compression lever, and we're off. The electric start problem was blamed on the starter motor. This was pulled off next and dismantled, and there was a half tide mark in the starter motor housing, and 2 of the brushes were jammed. When this was freed up, the motor started easily. However, we still wonder how the water got into the starter motor. Settling in. June came very quickly and Helen finished a job. Also, we had planned a 2-week holiday in Scotland with Helen's parents. We decided to move out of our little house to save money before we left, and thus we were again packing our belongings into tea chests for shipment back to Australia. We decided to pack all the essential items into the boat for sorting out when we returned. When we finished, we could only just get down the companionway. That would do until we returned from Scotland. It was a great trip. Taking a break at this point was difficult, but we had a great time in Scotland exploring the tourist sites and wandering the hills. This was certainly more fun than working on the boat, but eventually we returned to Wandering Star, and Helen's parents stayed in a nice apartment nearby while we moved on board. We sorted out our gear and found some bunks, but things were never really improved, for as we sorted out our gear, the new spaces were quickly taken up by boxes and more gear. The waterline rose higher and higher. When we finally left, the V berth and the cabin were packed solid, as was the quarter berth. We soon gave up using the forward berths and slept in the saloon. Since the forward area was well packed, we found it difficult to access the heads, so after deep discussion we decided to can the can and use the bucket. The Blake's head had cost the previous owner £800 to purchase and install, and we only got £50 from the local barge, the second-hand dealer. This was a bit disappointing, but it weighed quite a bit and certainly took up a lot of valuable space. We were able to go for a trial sail every week and test out our equipment, and slowly the cruising boat came together, as did our confidence in it. One of the first jobs was block off the aft end of the cockpit and make it a proper lazarette. The problem was, as the boat heeled, water flowed back up the cockpit drains and collected in the aft end of the cockpit. This involved quite a bit of welding and grinding and noise, etc. Our friend Jim was desperately working to repair his boat at the same time, and on this particular afternoon we'd loaned him our grinder, and Andy had his head down working when he heard Jim stop, and he thought, "Oh, beauty, my turn." Grabbed it, started cutting steel. This is very noisy. As it turned out, Jim had stopped grinding because of a complaint from one of our mates called Arnold. He'd come from London and works all week and comes down from London to have a nice, quiet weekend in the marina. "No problem," we said. "This is a boatyard, and the marina across the way where you pay 3 times more for mooring your boat." The poor guy complained to Helen, but in the end he had to accept that this was a plus as having people living and working there. And that there'd been 15 boats at the other end of the yard that had been robbed, and none had been touched at our end. Jim's departure. Jim was sailing by himself in Riga, which is a 27-foot Wasatch 1 design. We originally met Jim at Deacon's Boatyard, where he kept his boat. Jim is a professional ship's master working for P&O, and his spare time in recent years had been spent rebuilding Riga for this trip. We actually began our sea trials at the same time as Jim, and Jim had removed his original motor to allow for extra storage. Jim's departure gave us an opportunity to test our 30-year-old SAB, giving Jim a tow against the 4.5 knot Hamble River flood tide. Before Jim's departure, we encouraged him to fit an outboard to the transom, which he found very useful for manoeuvring into small anchorages. Jim planned to leave in the middle of summer. His first attempt was in early July, during the middle of the week, and we offered to tow him down to the Southampton waters. It was a stiff southwesterly wind blowing against the outgoing tide, and there was only one other yacht in the area. When we dropped him off the tow line, Riga took off to windward and left us standing. However, a short time later we noticed him lying ahull with all his sails flapping. We turned on the VHF and heard him put out a call to the Coast Guard. No reply was given, and so thinking the worst, we turned on our multi-sab and went to investigate. The other yacht on the water was a single-hander also, and had not given way to starboard and collected Ryger amidships and pulled off his windmill. Ryger survived due to the rugged construction, and once more we towed Jim up the handle. Jim's second attempt to leave was more successful. Jim and crew finally got away about a week later, and again we provided a tow. A golden rule for the handle is the tide is always against you, and if not, then there'll be a back eddy that is just as bad. This time the tide was running out, and to pick up the tow we had to motor upstream and turn to port across the current and track downstream between rows of boats. And due to our long keel and assorted gremlins, eddies, we had difficulty in completing the turn, and except for Jim's quick action, we would have collected a nice Tupperware boat. Anyway, all went well and Jim set his sails on the outgoing tide. We were soon joined by Bill on his endurance design called Puddle Splasher, and all three of us had a nice sail out towards the Needles. Helen pulled out her squeeze box for some sea shanties, and by sunset the wind was dying. We tempted Ryger and his crew to join us for a night in a nearby Newtown Creek for a pub meal and a drink. They were off and not stopping for anything, not even drinking the pub. When we last saw them in the fading light, Jim had his black tights on with his Arab headdress and doing a headstand in the cockpit. They had a great run for 3 weeks to Porto Santo, and the next time we do this, we're going to leave in July as well. Equipment. The best source of sensibly priced gear was boat jumbles, and they were weekly events during the summer in southern England. We found the best gear came from cruising folks who had just finished a cruise. We were able to get our Atlantic and southern UK charts from a couple who had just completed a 7-year Atlantic circuit. They were a bit old, but very useful and cost less than £1 each. We're also able to purchase a good offshore 4-person life raft for £400 from another offshore cruiser. We'd received a Beaufort Dolphin coastal life raft with our boat and did a deal with the local Messenger Marine Life Raft testing company, and the coastal raft was traded for an upgrade to the test for our offshore raft. The offshore raft had a double floor and 2 inflation rings with an inflating canopy. The basic equipment to this, we added extra food and water and a first aid kit. This was then packed in a new canister, and the raft was mounted just aft the mast. Virtue Rally. While working in the yard, we discovered Wandering Star was not in fact a Virtue design. In fact, it was a Lemster Sea Cruiser design. This was a Dutch design, very similar to the Virtue, with a bit more beam. We'd already joined the Virtue Owners Association. They did not mind. It was virtually a Virtue anyway. Before we departed, we were able to join the Virtue Owners Association for their annual rally to the Isle of Wight. A fantastic gathering of Virtues, old and new, with a great dinner and a presentation by Susan Hiscott where she showed one of her movies she'd made with her husband Eric in their early cruising days. This was brilliant.